Today, I want to take a look at how to grant permissions to a SharePoint group using MS Flow Power Automate. So here we're looking at a standard team site, and what we're going to do is create a new list for travel requests down here in the bottom left that require approval. So we'll go ahead and use the template, click Create. Here we can see we have our new list of travel requests, and we'll do it's a little bit of a description, requester, fill in a sample item, travel start date, maybe the travel end date, and we'll go ahead and hit save. So as part of creating these items, we'd like to grant permissions to the person who created it and a group of approvers, but not everyone. To make that possible, we want to come over here to Site Permissions. We'll go into Advanced. We'll take a look at what groups the site has. And then what we're going to do is create a new one just for approvers. So here I'm creating a new group called Travel Managers, and they are going to have no particular access to the site. We'll leave it empty, and we've got myself added in there. So from a flow perspective, what we want to do is grant access to this particular group, which we'll notice up here, membership group number 12 for travel managers. So SharePoint's tracking it as a group number. MS Flow can kick in to help us apply the permission. So here we'll do an automated cloud flow. We'll search the triggers for when a SharePoint item is created. And we're doing that, you could do create or modified, which will be a little bit further down here. We're going to do it only for create. We want this to execute one time when the request is made. Here we'll go ahead and pick up the URL for our list, bring it over, as that will be the site that we're working on. And on our dropdown, we see travel requests as an available list. We're going to add a new step. And we want the SharePoint grant access to an item or folder. And if we search for the keyword access, we're going to find another important step called stop sharing. That's what breaks inheritance on the item to go ahead and make it something unique where we can apply the grants. So the first step is to break inheritance by stop sharing. And then after that, we'll be able to grant the needed permissions. Now, which item are we working on? There's the ID for the same item. It's kind of funny. I mean, each of these steps needs the context to flow through, so it's a little bit repetitive that you kind of end up putting in the URL of the site you're working on every single step, but that's the nature of flow. Each of the steps is independent, and as we go through, you can do the drop downs, pick out the item, pick out the ID for the item, if there's a message needed, if there's a role that's needed. So message, notify, we're going to put no. We want this to be silent and in the background. So here on the recipients, we can have suggested people, dynamic content. What we're going to do there is add the created by email. So this will work out okay because it's an email address to grant one person. It's not going to help us with the group. We'll see that step here in just a minute. But for the one user that created the item, we're going to go ahead and pick the role as can edit, which will give them full access over the item that they created. And with these basic steps in place, we'll go ahead and save. And for granting access to a SharePoint group, we're not going to use the normal grant step. We're actually going to go in here and we're going to find the send HTTP to SharePoint. Now this step is interesting because it's an HTTP transaction, but it brings in all the headers and context that SharePoint needs for authentication. And I'm going to call this Grant Travel Manager in all caps, so it's very easy to find. And that is the name of our group. So over here for site address, we're going to go with the same thing and bring in the name of the site that we're working on. And then we're going to use a post method. There's a couple different ones available, but for granting, we're going to look at post. And this goes to all the REST API documentation. Anything you need to do that can be done with REST API, this is where we want to do it. And we want to use this step, not the generic send HTTP, because this one comes with the different authentication and headers that SharePoint is going to need. So what do we do for URL? It's a required field. And on this one, we have to craft a very particular URL for adding a SharePoint group into the permissions. So here we have the pattern. It's going to be underscore API list, get by title. So that's the name of the list. And then we have items, and we need to fill in the ID number in between the parentheses. Then we go to role assignments, add a role assignment, principal ID equals the number of the group, and then role definition ID is this particular number here. This actually comes from Microsoft, and this is going to be the contributor role. So we need to fill in two different ID numbers. The first is the item ID, and then the second one is the group ID. If we plug those two ID numbers in, this endpoint will do the work that we need. So let's go ahead and paste in the address. We'll get the ID of the item, and then here we'll get the ID of our group. The way to find that is to navigate to the group. If we navigate to the group in the browser, we'll see the ID number up here is 12. So we'll go ahead and put in 12, and we'll clean up some of the white space with a little bit of indentation. There we go. Now we have our URL that's needed, and that's it. That will grant access to the group. So the normal grant access step is really email driven, and it's a good wizard. It gets a lot done. It's very easy to use. But if you want to grant access to a group, we're going to need to do it with an HTTP request, and we're going to need to develop that endpoint following the REST API methods. We'll go ahead and save here and give it a test. So here we're filling in another new test item. We'll put some travel dates down. Go ahead and fill that out and hit save. There it is. Back over on Flow, we can go over and check our history for all. Now we can see that the MS Flow successfully executed. We can click into that item to go take a look at the pathway. Here we see going through the path, granting access, and yeah, it revokes the inheritance, so it goes to unique permissions. It grants access to the person who created the item, and then it does a post for the role assignments to take ID number 2 and grant access to group number 12. We can see right there, principal ID number. If we go back over to the list itself, and we pick the one item and do manage access, we can see the permissions on the right. I kind of like the advanced full screen. And from that view, we can see travel managers up here has been granted access, and that's a SharePoint group. So we don't have to expand the group. We don't have to grant everyone by email address. We can grant access to a SharePoint group. And the way we're able to get there is by using REST APIs and this particular endpoint of add role assignment with the ID number of the group. Thanks for watching.